This is Monica Perez with a returning guest you all know and love, Jeremy Kuzmarov, author of 4 books on U.S. foreign policy, including The Russians Are Coming Again, the first Cold War as tragedy, the second as farce. As managing editor of Covert Action magazine, Jeremy and his team are keeping us apprised of the real stories behind the biggest events of the day. And as much as I respect Jeremy and his work, I do recognize that our ideologies are completely different. Jeremy thinks government's legit, and I have given up on the state completely. But in a post-ideological world of corruption and collusion, people of principle can still find common ground. So thank you, Jeremy, for joining me again as we find common ground. How are you?
Pretty good. Very good. Thank you.
And this is actually extremely relevant for your most recent activist endeavor. Didn't you just come back from the rage against the war in Ukraine? And that was quite a meeting of different people on the political spectrum, but all coming together in the anti-war movement.
Yeah, I think it was really a terrific event. There was a really nice spirit there, and hopefully, it's the beginning of a revitalized anti-war movement. And yeah, there were a few naysayers. I think some people on the left didn't want to associate with people on the right, but I think the best line of the day was Jimmy Dore, the comedian, who said, if there's a fire raging in your house, yeah, and the firefighters come to put it out, you're not going to quiz him, on his view about gay rights or transgender or. So, I mean, those anyway, they elevate those policies and they want to divide people. Yeah, Dora also said, they want that's the game of the oligarchy. They want you to hate your neighbor because he didn't get a vaccine or whatever side you're on. He's like he's a liberal. He's the conservatives. Are kind of indoctrinated in any way to hate liberals and think they're all. He said not all liberals love Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, and he said not all conservatives are these white nationalists, Trumper gun nuts. But he said only gun nuts.
I know. That was so funny that they are all gun nuts. That is
Yeah.
true. And that is true, though. It was very,
Well, if
very
they're not
clever.
going to shoot you, it shouldn't bother you too much.
But yeah, I did notice that you touch on something that I have really have observed for a long time now. And that is if say 50, 60, 70, 80 million people in this country are on the left, and that same number almost, give or take, 10%, 20%, 25%, I don't care, but there's tens of millions of people on the other side. Are you really thinking that the people on the other side are evil assholes, like idiots and jerks? They're all idiots and jerks. And I actually did a little experiment. I tried to see if people in my life who I think it was driving. I was like, I just want to watch and see, because if people on the left or the right are like completely irrational or evil or whatever, they should all be terrible at everything. Like the bad ones should be bad drivers. They should be rude. They should, cancel appointments. Like they should do everything bad and wrong. And I found that I really couldn't. I mean, I do think that like super religious people who dedicate their lives to charity, like they will be there for you. They'll do all good Samaritan. But in regular rank and file, like the ideology, I really feel like it's probably related to how your brain is made up more than if you're a good person or a bad person. And hating the people on the other side, it really could go a lot further. Just try to understand them a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of politics also comes from your background, your life experiences, the area you may have grown up, your education, the kind of courses you may have been exposed to, books you read. So, I think there are good people on all sides, and I mean, personally, I agree a lot, libertarian on a lot of issues, like with regard to civil liberty, drugs. So, on some issues, I disagree, like social welfare program, but. I mean, that's life. You're always going to disagree. I disagree. I used to argue with my father of the Israeli Palestine. He was kind of stubborn on that issue. Eventually, he came around, but
Really?
I didn't hate him. Just one issue. On a lot of other issues, I did a similar political outlook as him. So, I didn't hate him because on that issue we disagreed. So, and
And
that
there
was
is
Moore's point. Like, why do you hate? I mean, most America, he was saying it's really the oligarchy. I mean, we should be unified politically. It's the 1%, the oligarchy, that's destroying American society. That's pitting us against each other. That's waging these senseless wars. That's squandering our national treasures on these senseless wars. So if we have an enemy, it should be those people in power and the top 1%, not your neighbor in whatever kind of community you live, if he has a slightly different viewpoint as you.
I do think that the Constitution makes room for this just simply by putting all that, the police, it's all the police powers or whatever, but it includes welfare and health and everything. All that stuff goes to the states. Now, I don't know too many people on the left who are for states' rights, but there is the possibility there of having petri dishes, like 50 different organizations of how you deal with the everyday culture and society. But where it comes to the traditional or the constitutional roles of the federal government, from foreign policy to like national, having marriage laws or whatever on a national level, it's not necessary. But we could. There's no ideological difference, really. There shouldn't be, about foreign policy. Like, what American left or right should really want imperialism, because that's what it really comes down to. It's not defensive. When nobody has the capacity to hurt you, Syria really does not have the capacity to hurt us. We should not be bombing Syria. It's immoral. For the right should think of it as immoral, and the left should think of it as immoral and unconstitutional and everything else. I don't understand why it's so hard. I mean, they just have a stranglehold on our minds, the politicians, to convince us that any of these wars are in our interest.
That's right. Yeah, it's not really an issue of right left. It's an issue of right versus wrong.
Yes.
And luckily, there are a lot of people who see what's right. Unfortunately, as you say, a lot of people have been kind of brainwashed by the incessant propaganda and the media and the education system. So it's our job to try and educate the public better, or people we're in contact with.
Yeah, so when you were at the protest, did you first of all, was there hostility by anybody? Did any counter protests arrive, or people rude to you? Do you felt like you were undermined? Was it did you get the kind of turnout that you wanted? Is it a first step? Tell us more about the actual event.
Okay, well, I was in the crowd, and then I went in the press area where I was able to interview some of the people, the speakers. So that was nice, and get close-up photos of them. I didn't see. Apparently, there were a small number of demonstrators. I didn't see them; they weren't visible. I could see when I went to the press area. I could see the whole crowd. I didn't see them. All of these counter demonstrators. Though somebody told me they were there, but there were just like three or four of them, pro-Ukrainian. So it was a very nice.
Oh,
Yeah, it was just like maybe a couple, less than under a dozen, maybe less than half a dozen, I think, just like one or two odd people with a counter apparently, but I didn't see them. The speakers, yeah, a lot of them you couldn't tell. I didn't recognize every speaker, and if I looked some up, they may have been libertarian, but they were basically saying a lot of the same as the speakers who be identified more left wing. So that's what I mean. They're not really huge differences. I mean, I think everybody at the rally would want to see the government investing its resources in the needs of the domestic population, and on these senseless wars that in this case, and many of the speakers said, I mean, this is really dangerous. This is we're on the threshold of potential nuclear war because of this. And Tulsi Gabbard in her speech, I thought, gave a very good speech, and she said, we're all united at this rally. Everybody's united in one thing. We value human life. We want to see human life. Our lives, our friends, our family, and the people of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. We value their life too. We don't want them dying in a war that's avoidable. And I think this war was avoidable. Roger Waters gave the speech at the end, Pink Floyd, and he went into how this war could have been prevented very easily. All they had to do was, there was a promise that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. All they had to do was, successive governments of the United States just follow what James Baker had promised Gorbachev, but they didn't do that. And then he's like, well, all they have to do is just allow Ukrainians to decide their own government, not interfere and back a coup in 2014. That's going to screw everything, anger the Russian. I mean, you overthrow the pro-Russian regime, and that triggered the war in eastern Ukraine, brought in the Russian. Then he's like, well, then you had the Minsk agreement. All you have to do is support the Minsk agreement. So, I mean, there are just some easy steps, that could have been followed, common sense to avoid this cataclysm. But there's obviously, and that's the divide. I think the most of the American population, if they knew and understood all the facts, almost universally would support those measures. But then you have an elite 1% and corporate elite who's so greedy and they want to dominate the world and they can't tolerate any rival. The minute Russia starts to look a little stronger, and back to I mean, Russia was a regional power for many centuries, and they're starting to look like their old self a little bit, regain some power after the 90s. That's when the U.S. can't tolerate that, so they start sabotaging the Russian and basically causing this conflict, or they want to exploit all the oil for themselves in the Central Asia. They can't tolerate Russia having some control over some of the oil, even though they're the natural leader in that area. So I mean, it's just the greed of the 1% carrying out policies that are against humanity, basically. And that's why people have to unify on behalf of humanity. And it's not really an issue of left or right. I mean, the normal give and take of politics could continue, but people have to unify to stop this insanity.
And I would think that when you said, well, everybody there would rather them spend this money on some of our domestic problems, you could even go further and say, okay, maybe only the left like that. Even me, I'm like, I don't know. I believe in limited government and I don't want the federal budget to be so big at all. I want my tax money back. Either way, neither side should want this money spent in this way. And I would go further than even those enumerated items from or the list from Roger Waters and say that yes, the coup was conducted by the US. It was, and over the years, that was 8 years ago or 9 now, but 8 years to the time when it was actually provoked Russia. But I've come to believe that they intentionally provoked Russia, like actually cut off all avenues of recourse other than making it military. And I've read things on the Rand Corporation website that makes me think that they're that calculated, and that's in that particular case. And but I and
Yeah, I would agree with you.
yeah,
Yeah.
you could respond to that. And then I had one more thing about Tulsi Gabbard. So Tulsi Gabbard is a lot of people in my circles, including me, are a little bit skeptical of her as, I would say, a limited hangout. And I never know how far down the rabbit hole you go because you're so academic and measured and well trained and were a teacher and all of that. You have very high standards of separating facts from speculation. But for me, so she has a military background, which absolutely plenty of military people become anti-war. There's no question about that. But she's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is, a sister of the Chatham House and all these organizations that really do work towards world domination. Maybe she's not anymore, but she was. But I just wonder, like, say we don't know what's in her heart, but we know what comes out her mouth, and it's valid. Like, how do you, and I ask you these kind of questions a lot, but how do you think about that? Like, how do you care? Do you want to know? You want to take what you can get?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of opportunists. I think people would see the moment. There is now a sizable anti-war bloc. There is a lot of unease in the population. So anybody who's bent on a political career or obtaining political power might try and capitalize on this moment. And as you say, you don't know. I don't know. There are some suspicious aspects about it. I've heard before that she's, I think, even still active duty military, and but I don't know, for sure. I mean, there could also be a smear campaign against her because she is speaking out like no other dominant political figure, and there may be an effort, to spread rumors about her when she's, she is speaking truth to power, and it's very rare for somebody of her stature who is in the U.S. Congress, who, I mean, she speaks very well. She's an elegant woman. She speaks very well. So she has those qualities of a leader. So I mean, she become dangerous to the power that be. So I don't know. It could go either way. She could be an opportunist, or there could be some agenda, or she could be just being subjected to a smear campaign, and she's very sincere. And in her case, I really don't know, so I can't
Yeah.
make any judgment.
And
But
and you really can't know also if people if some people at some point do have integrity and maybe they are on the inside and really can't tolerate it anymore. I don't know about that. I think
yeah,
in the
has happened. Yeah,
extreme, people will get killed, as you have talked about many times. Like if they don't get the memo, if they don't read the memo and back off. But there's a time between. So you see, and you do, and I want to talk about some of the more recent articles you've done on this. There are times there are plenty of assassinations. I know you have a whole series at Covert Action Magazine .com that talks about assassinations. I hope and that you'll put them together in a book. But there are assassinations, and there's a point between, and a lot of them, if not the majority, are insiders at some point. Like it's almost like the mob. Like you're only really in danger if you're in the circle, have firsthand knowledge or whatever. There's a point between turning away from it and getting assassinated. That there have to be some people who start to say stuff. So I'm not going to write her off. I do tend to be more skeptical rather than less skeptical, but about any of these people. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about some of your latest on the assassination front. I
yeah.
was
And on that point, I mean,
Yeah.
if she got more powerful, I mean, right now she's kind of on the margins, and I mean, she still has a following and has an audience. Uh, But I mean, they had their ways. During the primary, I mean, they ridiculed her. They called her an Assad apologist and Putin lover and those kind of things. And I mean, she didn't last too long in the primary, and I think she was excluded after one or two debates. And they used McCarthyist tactic to smear her, and there was some negative article in the New York Times. So that's the usual method. I mean, if she got really, then we had Bernie Sanders, who was challenging things in his own way, and they had the ways of removing him and kind of co-opting him. So I think those are the preferred methods. But if somebody like her really rose high, then they could be a threat. Their life could start to be at risk.
So I've always been a big Ron Paul fan and supporter, and I can't deny some people say, "Oh yeah, he's an inside job," for whatever reason. I mean, what that would be, I really don't know, because there's like almost nothing. Yeah, he could come out and say Dick Cheney conspired to effect 9/11. Like he could say that. I'm not sure that would do anybody any good. But after all these years of like really being skeptical about everyone, I just still love Ron Paul. And I was on a podcast the other day where the host was telling me, and I guess this sounds familiar, but I didn't hear it myself, that at a certain point when when it actually came out that he was winning, and he did win Iowa. I don't know if you're even aware of that, but ultimately, if you look in Wikipedia, who won the Iowa primary in 2012, it was Ron Paul. And he said at that point he stopped flying in planes and stuff. He was afraid they might kill him. They might actually kill him. And I thought, wow, yeah, like that's where you have to be. And you have to be smart enough. I think you have to be smart enough to back down. I really do. I just don't think it does any good. I don't think these assassinations ever, you never win after you get killed. They get to write the story after that. And I feel like there's a certain point where you just don't even want to go too far. And that could explain why not everybody goes as far even as Ron Paul. It's scary. I even think of Dave Chappelle. Like I think that they told him to, back off from some of the more aggressive comedy back in the day, and he, whatever, dropped out, and then eventually was like, I'm not doing any good having no airtime whatsoever. I can do 95% of my truth or 80% of my truth and still make a living and stay alive and not do too much harm. I think that there's only so much you can do, because I feel like it's so buttoned up at the top that you can't bust through if you speak too much truth to power.
That's
Speaking
certainly
of
true.
which,
Yeah, and I mean, at the rally they
yeah.
had Dennis Kucinich. He Oh, yeah, I mean,
Oh,
he's an
yeah.
example. I mean, I think they did redistricting. I mean, he was a true, progressive who spoke out against a lot, including the Democratic war. Like, I know he opposed the Libya war. I think he was one of the few Democrats who'd opposed the Kosovo bombing. And he was a true anti-war, anti-imperialist, and also progressive. And I mean, he did last a fair amount of time, which is amazing. So I mean, it goes to show you could potentially, um, you know, go, at least have a pretty good career. But of course, then they got rid of him. They did some redistricting, and there were forces arrayed against him. Certainly when
Yeah.
he tried to run for president, and he was ousted from the U.S. Congress. But he did last a while in the Congress, which is pretty rare because figure like Bernie Sanders kind of sold out. I mean, he supported the war in Ukraine and Russia, and he tried to marshal his followers into the Hillary Clinton camp, and he kind of played his role. He did his duty for the Democratic Party, but he kind of sold out in the process. So, and he was at times on the outer edge, of acceptability. He was taking some pretty radical positions. So it goes to show, yeah, it's very difficult. And unfortunately, I mean, many of these people are careerists. Their career is number one. And I mean, sometimes like a guy can make, if they have the charisma and following of like a Sanders, and they're in the Congress, and then they're not, they're removed, but they've got a powerful, persona and following, so they could do a lot on the outside to really build a social movement. But their true colors are seen, that they're out for their own career, and you get a lot of opportunists, who see the tide. I mean, now the tide with the huge inequality levels and the unhappiness with the U.S. foreign policy and these endless wars, opportunists are coming to the fore, but they're not necessarily sincere anti-war leaders. They're sometimes out for themselves. And I mean, even Trump now is billing himself as an anti-war person. He's criticizing the war in Ukraine and saying he would end it, but he's
Like
given
Syria.
other indications at other time. I mean, he just goes with whatever he thinks popular at that moment, and you get that a lot with politicians, unfortunately.
Well, the Trump dropped so many bombs. I thought Obama dropped a lot of bombs on Syria, and I've heard recently that Trump dropped even more. But I will say about Kucinich, I was always a huge fan of his, ideology aside. I understand the mentality of people who want the government safety net. I totally understand it, and I think it depends on how cynical you are about government, or the separation of moral obligations versus the use of force. I mean, I understand the ideological divide. I always think of it as Aristotle versus Plato. We could get into that sometime. I bet you could school me on that. But there was a plane ride, a famous plane ride that Kucinich took, apparently, where he got on the plane with some deep staters, and when he got off the plane, like, some of his opinions changed forever. And I think that's when he probably lost his spirit to keep fighting. Like, who cares if I'm in, real guy of integrity would say, who cares if I'm in power, if I keep them from redistricting, if my hands are tied, what's the point? Because I don't think he was a careerist.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And
So
that's true.
I
This guy, there's a guy who just died yesterday or the last week named James Abourek, and I once interviewed him. He was the first Arab American congressman, but he was very progressive on many issues, including Native American rights and with U.S. foreign policy, opposing the Vietnam War and a lot of the clandestine operations. But yeah, he said he only served one term because he felt he couldn't get anywhere in the Senate. And I mean, he wanted to do advance, progressive causes, but it was almost futile. And yeah, once he saw that futility, he just didn't want to even continue working in the Senate.
Because then you have to really be scummy. Like, then you
Yeah,
realize,
you don't
so
want
then
to.
you might as well just go be like you know, I don't know why I was gonna say
Yeah,
a
he
real
felt he
estate
could do
agent.
more on the outside. He was a lawyer, and he ended up
Yeah.
representing, human rights and civil rights cases. He felt
Yeah,
he
much
could do
better.
much more positive for society because he couldn't change the view of the others in the Senate, and the kind of bills he wanted to pass, he had no chance to pass. And
And in order to keep your
the
seat, you
tide was
really have
turning.
to,
Oh, go ahead.
be, if you wanna keep your seat, you have to
Yeah,
do
he
some
had to
shady dealings, like,
compromise.
it's the worst. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like,
he
it's
didn't
not
want to
only
compromise with the donors, so he just
right.
felt more free trying to improve society on the outside as a lawyer. So,
And what is he up to now?
well, he passed away in
Oh,
the last week, but he was in the 70s. Yeah, he was like
oh,
very quite
I
well
didn't hear
known
you.
as a progressive senator in the 1970s. and he supported a lot of progressive causes, including like abolishing the CIA and you know
Did
ending the
you write anything
Vietnam.
about him, or do you have the interview? Can we repost that?
Well, his obituary came out in a number of newspapers. I had interviewed him in 2008 because I was studying the Office of Public Safety, which they ran a police training program, these covert police training program in the Cold War, and he had actually passed the act that led to the abolishing of the Office of Public Safety within USAID, and he had met Brazilians who had been tortured under these police training programs. So he did achieve some good legislation, but yeah, and he had told me in the interview that after some years he couldn't get anything passed, and yeah, he didn't want to kind of sell his soul, so he after his term was up, he decided not to run for reelection, and he worked as a civil rights lawyer.
Okay, I'll put his obituary in the show
Yeah,
notes, which
Daniel
people
Boric, he's an interesting guy. Yeah, he
uh
tried to make a difference, and I mean there are some good people I think in the Congress. They're usually a small number, and as you say, with time they feel they usually have to make a choice
right.
whether to compromise their values and integrity or not.
I think
And
so.
if they don't last too long.
So I have to say, your most recent article, I guess maybe it rang a bell, but I was pretty shocked that um, you're suggesting. I don't know what There's definitely two sides of the story, but that Hunter S. Thompson was murdered. I do remember there were some fishy things about his death, but I had thought that he had left some kind of suicide note, but you cast doubt on that. Can you tell me, well, how did this catch your eye? Why is this something that you chose to write about this week? Because it's the 18th anniversary of his death?
Yeah. Yeah, I always admired Hunter Thompson. I mean, he was a kind of idiosyncratic figure, but as a writer, he was really brilliant. He was really candid and expressed himself well. He invented a style of journalism known as gonzo journalism, where he kind of injects himself in the story. And was a gifted storyteller. And two of his most famous books that I have are one was on the Hell's Angels. How I think he made his reputation with a series for The Nation magazine, and he kind of infiltrated the gang and hung out with them and exposed life in the Hell's Angels. And then he wrote a great book called Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, 1972, and he followed around Nixon and both sides, the Republican and Democratic primary, and he hated Nixon. I mean, he saw how corrupt he was, and he injects humor into the story, and he talks about his drug exploits. But he also saw how phony like all the polls, not just Nixon, but like he has some good lines and observation about like Hubert Humphrey, who was a Democratic Party candidate in the 68 election and then was trying again in 72. And he saw Humphrey as like hopelessly dishonest, just like political hack. And I think the one person he liked was George McGovern, and he got trounced in the 72 election. But yeah, it's really just sharp observations, that book. And I went assigned it in some courses I was teaching, and it's a book that you like to read. I mean, the pages really turn. He turns into a kind of riveting story, and then he wrote the novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that was made into a famous movie with Johnny Depp, and it's kind of about the underside of the counterculture and the American dream. And yeah, at one point he ran for sheriff in Colorado in his county, and he was like running on a drug at that time very radical platform, legalizing drugs. And actually, he shaved his head because he was associated with the counterculture. So he shaved his head so that he would have less hair than his opponent, so he could call him a long, because at that time it was like a slur. So he was long-haired hippies, and he was kind of one of the hippies, sort of. So he shaved his head, and then he attacked his opponent as a long hair. So,
Very clever.
very funny
Yeah.
guy, yeah. Maybe he has a lot in common with Jimmy Dores.
Yes,
Kind of
yes.
like that, yeah.
So you feel the thing that really got me thinking here is that, because I thought, why would they go in and assassinate him then after all those years? But it was right after 9/11, right? I mean, long enough after 9/11 that he could figure it out, but not so long that it was hackneyed.
Yeah, I mean, he still had stature. He became a legend because those stories it made him famous, and he was kind of a celebrity. So And yeah, I think he got a lot into booze and drugs, and he wasn't as prolific a writer as he might have been. But then I think he kind of got back into it, and he was actually a columnist for ESPN, but because he loved sports as well. But yeah, he was working on a major story about 9/11, and he was a celebrity and a celebrity journalist. So if the legend Hunter Thompson would have this big story, I think it would be
Right.
a huge impact and a huge ripple effect. So that could be the motive. I mean, it's pure speculation in this case. We don't know exactly what happened. I mean, perhaps he made some other enemies. I mean, he got into trouble himself a little bit, so it's possible there were personal vendettas against him. But the evidence seems to suggest he was murdered. I mean, he was in a phone call with his wife, and he had a very young wife, much younger than him, and very attractive woman. And I mean, he was, I mean, what man who was like in his 60s? I mean, his health was good. He had a very young and lovely wife, and he had the one grandson who was visiting him when he was killed, and he was in the middle of a phone conversation. All
Yeah.
of a sudden, the phone went dead,
I
and I
mean,
mean,
unless he thought that was, like, humorous, you know what I mean? Like, maybe that's the only thing I could think
it
of
could
is
be. I
that
mean, he did have a dark sense of humor, but even for him, it would seem
cruel.
odd and yeah, I mean, and maybe he was kind of a showman and celebrity who liked the adulation. So I mean, if he was going to go out, he would have gone out more with a bang than that. And then they found some suicide note, but it was kind of a fishy note, and it seemed that it may have been a stage note. And he was like lamenting the end of because he loved football and it was winter, so it was like it's the end of the season. But I mean, there'd be another season coming up.
Yeah.
It
I didn't
just didn't
even
really
get that.
make sense.
I thought it was a
Yeah,
metaphor. I thought when it said,
it
like,
could
so
be a metaphor,
let me
but I
read it.
mean, there's an odd chance he did commit suicide, but it seemed really fishy, and it seemed that he was probably murdered.
And he said, now, do you think this is credible? The report that he said to a friend that he was going to be killed and that they would make it look like suicide. Did you find that
Yeah,
report believable?
yeah. Well, he said, "I know how these bastards work." Yeah,
Wow.
he had
So
said.
here's the note, and what's fishy about it is that only the title of the note called "Football Season is Over" was in his hand. So he could have been writing something completely different. They found a piece of paper that had something in his writing and they made it into a suicide note. And that must have been kind of difficult to do if this was a setup because that's a weird title. Football season is over. And then it goes on to say, no more games, no more bombs, no more walking, no more fun, no more swimming. 67, that's 17 years past 50, 17 more than I needed or wanted. Boring. I'm always bitchy. I'm no fun for anybody. 67, you're getting greedy. Act your age. Relax. This won't hurt. I mean, it is a little bit of a stretch to start with the football season is over, and that's your. I mean, suicide. Like even a little child wouldn't be that short sighted.
Yeah. And I mean, if he's working on a major article on 9/11, wouldn't he want to be around to see it come out? So,
Right, I mean, you might as well like, that's what I used to say about my radio show. I was like, "Look, you want me to come out?" People would harass me nonstop for not harping on 9/11 was an inside job, and there were just a few things I didn't hit, and for some reason, I just felt like I will completely lose the audience if I say that because it was a conservative radio station. I had the same slot as Rush Limbaugh, and I was on Saturday, so people would have the radio on, they're listening to Rush all week, and then they would hear me, and they were just scared of Arab terrorists. They were terrified of Arab terrorists. And if you said something like that, and they loved Dick Cheney, you just would. Then nobody would listen to you anymore about anything. And I said, but on my last day, I will. Like I would allude to it, but I'll go out with a bang, and I will do that. And actually, it was in reverse order. Somebody did convince me to just lay it all out there, and I laid it all out about everything. I was like, "This is what I think. This is what I think. This is what I think." And I will say, could have been a coincidence, maybe not. I was shown the door after 8.5 years, the week I did that show. But I had thought in my mind, I will go out with a bang. If I'm ready to retire, and that's just how you think because you have this opportunity that you don't want to, it's just like Ron Paul and stuff. Like, do you really want to come out on 9/11? Do you really want to get on that plane? Like, what's the best use of your assets at this point in time? And he would have to be, it doesn't sound like he was somebody who didn't understand how to play that game, especially if he did the long-haired hippie thing. It's inconsistent.
Well, yeah, and at that point, though, he had nothing to lose. I mean, he was rich, he was famous, he kind of marched to his own tune, so he could do whatever he wanted. Although I guess that the only threat is that somebody would kill him.
Yeah, very interesting. And then another the article you wrote before that. Uh, oh wow, you just put an article out right as we were talking. It looks like you put an article was the Pentagon and CIA behind the COVID-19 pandemic. That just literally came across my screen. How did that
Yeah.
happen while we were talking?
Well, I don't post them on the website.
Okay.
Somebody else posts them. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to talk about the other thing I thought was really interesting was this Gennaro Garcia Luna story? Which do you want to which do you
Well,
want
they're
to tell us?
both rather juicy. Yeah, maybe we'll start with the drug war. And
Yes. Yeah.
Garcia Luna was convicted last week, and I mean he was the highest-ranking Mexican official to be convicted in the United States. And I mean he was paying huge bribes to the. He would basically align with the Sinaloa cartel. And what we see is that the drug war was not a war on drugs, but it was basically a war, between drug cartels. And the U.S. and Mexican government, for many years, were on the side of the Sinaloa cartel. And the Plan Merida, the U.S. government invested billions of dollars in the drug war in this Plan Merida that started with George W. Bush, was expanded by the Obama administration, and we see the total waste of taxpayer dollar. Just like what we're seeing in Ukraine or Afghanistan, billions of dollars are just wasted because. I mean, when you have the Mexican government aligning with one of the drug cartels, you're not actually fighting drugs. And a lot of those weapons, there was this Operation Fast and the Furious, that weapons were actually given directly to drug cartel operatives. And yeah, the idea that they would trace them and that would be a way to get them, but they were just pumping weapons into the country. And Tosh Plumley, I interviewed him. He was a former CIA contract pilot, and he said it's been a longstanding practice. The arms go from the United States into Mexico or South America, and the drugs come back. And the CIA governments are protecting leading drug traffickers, so it's coming back. And it's a big business for everybody. And talk about, yeah, like what we're saying about the 1%. I mean, this oligarchy, a lot of way, and the richest 1%, some of them are making their big money off the drug trade. And I mean, they don't really want to stop it because the cartels put their money in banks, and it's a major source of revenue for banks. And the Mexican economy at various points could have collapsed without drug revenue. So they don't seem to really actually want to fight. It's just a phony war, but it's billions of dollars. And I mean, there are real casualties. That all those weapons just increase the violence, and the cartels are emboldened when they're supported by the government. They can do whatever they want. They can kill hundreds of thousands of people. And then they are the police come down hard on smaller time dealer or drug users, spend years behind prison when the big shots are getting away and living in luxury. Yeah, one thing that came out in the trial was how these drug lords live, with huge mansions and zoos, and they felt immune. I mean, eventually time did catch up with Luna and a lot of the other ones, but they survived for a while and flourished for a while.
So how did this so I'm looking at this sketch from the courtroom, and he is the this is just amazing to me how high ranking he was. He was the Secretary of Public Security. So there's pictures of him with the president at the time. And he is in a, I guess, I don't know if it's a US, I don't think it was a district court, but it's in a New York courtroom. Was he forcibly extradited? Like how did he end up
Yeah,
getting there, and why do you think that they threw the book at him?
that's a good question. Yeah, I think he moved to Florida after he served in the Calderon government. And now you have Lopez Obrador, who maybe is trying to clean up some of the corruption. But yeah, he ended up in Miami, Florida, I guess because of his connections, and he bought a nice, very nice home in Miami, Florida. And I think he even got an MBA degree. He was trying to look legit and stuff, but he had stolen a huge amount of money. And eventually the law caught up with him. I think they were going after him for a while because it was so overt in his case. Like, a lot of his associates had already been imprisoned, and I think they had been on him for many years, even going back to the 1990s, because he had the staple of luxury cars when he was still, a relatively low-level police official. And then he had an organization that was kind of like the American FBI, but I mean, the pay wouldn't be high enough to have a staple of luxury cars. So there was huge suspicion about him going back many years. And I mean, the U.S. government knew about it. That's the whole phoniness of the war on drugs is there. This rhetoric that they're fighting drugs, we're going to be successful, and we have to marshal all this billions of dollars, and yet they know a lot of the top Mexican police officials are extraordinarily corrupt. They even have the documentation of that, and there are reports about it, and they don't care because they don't really want to fight the drug trade. And the CIA may be directly profiting off of it to fund covert operation, whether in Mexico against left-wing groups or other dissident groups, and other parts of Latin America. So they end up collaborating with these basically gangsters who infiltrate the government.
I had done a lot of work on this Operation Fast and Furious, which was that it was the drug running and the guy. It was there was also like literally an Operation Cash Washer or something crazy that went alongside it that I don't even think it hit anybody's radar. But it was about just funneling tons and tons of guns down to Mexico for the Sinaloa cartel, and I believe it was related to trying to fix an election, the presidential election. I mean, there was a lot of work done by a guy named Farrago on, I think it was published on The Truth About Guns, which isn't what I mean, that is a truth about guns. But I
Hmm.
remember realizing that the whole gun drug trade at those levels, and the amount of money that by keeping it a black market, the amount of money is just staggering, and may even be taxpayer money, because my sister was a drug addict for many years and she would not have been able to maintain that if she hadn't gotten welfare. She was kept on methadone for decades, and it didn't stop her from doing other stuff too. And it was just crazy. And I think you can't overestimate the amount of money and power we're talking about in this. It could be the most powerful industry in the world. And then you can talk about the legal drugs too, Pfizer and stuff. I mean, it's like the whole world is just covered with drug dealers.
Hmm. Well, that's true, and that's one reason people in power may not want to actually stop the drug trade because there's staggering levels of money involved. And as I was saying, yeah, it gets filtered into legitimate economy. A lot of these drug traffickers, some of the top ones, if they're successful and able to survive, then they start to launder into the legitimate economy and present themselves as legitimate businessmen and develop legitimate businesses. And then the money is laundered and invested in banks who make enormous profits off of this. So they don't want to see it come to a stop.
And think about the civil rights they're allowed to violate in the name of the drug war. I mean, it's really galling when
Mhm.
you think that the government is in on perpetuating the drug trade, and at the same time says that they have to suspend our civil liberties, asset forfeiture, things like that, because they're just having such a hard time stopping the drugs. I mean, it's infuriating.
Yeah, well, and that's another kind of con game is that they have these very lax civil forfeiture laws, so they actually seize a lot of property from people. They seize their car, their boats, homes, and in many cases it may be illegitimate seizures, and they're just making huge money off this. So it's flat out robbery, and that's one reason police forces support. They become a powerful lobby group for sustaining harsh drug control measures because it profits them enormously, and it gives legitimacy to get more funding for the police and more heavy duty military equipment. And as we know, there are tremendous abuses associated with the policing of the war on drugs, and they use military style tactics against drug traffickers, sometimes small level dealer or drug users, and the draconian sentencing for people, who may simply need have a addiction problem, or just need treatment or help. Instead, they're given years in prison, while the big shots usually get off scot free. So the double standard are really galling, and some of the human rights abuses are also appalling. About 10 years ago, I went to a there's a group. I think it's funded by George Soros, but it's called Drug Policy Alliance. And I went to one of their conferences about 10 years ago, and I mean, there were a lot of good speakers. And during the conference, they had they had a book display, and they had like a video playing. It was like 2 day or 3 day conference, and throughout the whole time, it was just story after story of somebody who had been caught up in the drug war and was like either falsely imprisoned or unjustly imprisoned, or like somebody whose boyfriend had some drugs in their car, and they were driving the car and they got like a 20-year sentence. This is like a promising young person who's going to
Oh,
college, and it's just like all these sad stories of people given such long sentences, usually just like guilt by association, or some got killed because the police, the way they police this is they use informants, and then they're considered a snitch. And there's so much
right.
violence associated with the policing of drugs. And I mean, it's debatable how harmful these drugs are compared to other things people consume, and it should be treated more as a public health issue. And ultimately, I think many argue the criminalization is what fueled a lot of the huge profits of these illegal cartels, and that it would be better if it was put into the legal economy. That may be one key solution.
I will say a couple of things. One is a guy named Anthony McLean was in a car. He was the passenger in a car in Pasadena, near, not too far near where I live. And the car was stopped for a traffic violation, like something was wrong with the license plate. Anthony McLean had some kind of, I don't know, pot warrant out against him or whatever. And he decided to run away. He was just a passenger in a car getting stopped for traffic. The cop shot him in the back as he was running away. By coincidence, that cop's like lapel cam or whatever was not on, was not functioning. They quote found a gun that Anthony McLean supposedly had thrown. The gun was in pieces, so he threw it and it burst into pieces. I mean, it seemed like something that the cop found on the floor of his car, if you ask me. And it was such a clear cut case of that. Any cop whose cam is not working should, like, there should be you lose your presumption of innocence. You know what I mean? It should, that's what it would be like for a regular person. And it didn't get the nationwide coverage as the ones that are more ambiguous, though, I think, because that causes more conflict. This was such a clear cut case of this guy getting shot in the back. And the reason he ran away and is dead, from what I recall, was just a pot thing. And they said there was something in his pants. I was like, probably pot. Although it's legal here now. So maybe it was some other drug thing. I don't know if it was really old. Like they do that sometimes. It's like, okay, it's legal now, but even old thing. But it was some drug related incident this guy had in his past, and I think that he was shot in the back for it and and the cop got away with it. And I would just consider somebody who's just using drugs or dealing or selling drugs or whatever, that is somebody involved in arm's length transactions with other willing people. I mean, that should not be a crime. And then it makes people not respect the law, because the law is unjust. It's fundamentally unjust. And then you see the double standard, and it's very clear. Now, George Soros, why is he involved in legalizing drug? I would say there's this really annoying wrinkle about all of this, that you look at the pot legalization out here, and it led to this. First of all, I don't think that you're allowed to just grow it pesticide free in your backyard and sell it for $5 a bag like it would be because it's a weed. It's a freaking weed. It's hard to actually eradicate weeds, and it's literally a weed. And then but now that it's big business and you have to get licensed and taxed and all of that stuff, there's just this proliferation of these artificial products that are, the vaping it's so powerful. I mean, I know people who've gone to the hospital because they were, whatever, old, and they went to a concert. They remember what it was like to smoke pot. Somebody hands them a vape and they're in the hospital because it was so powerful. I know two different people like that they just thought they were dying. And I wonder if George Soros is behind it because ultimately that approach will be bad for people, will neutralize the political actor or something. I don't know, but it's annoying to me that Soros is on that side of it sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I think it's a good cause. Yeah, it's unfortunate it takes a Soros money. I mean, maybe he supports that cause. I mean, he's not
He
evil in
did
every,
support
or
the
perhaps his
first
agenda is
one.
to divert people from economic issues into this area. That may be one of his goals. Um, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, but it's annoying to me, and I remember when the first state legalized pot, which was Colorado, and George Soros had above board, like you could actually see that he or one of his organizations gave $4 million to the campaign, and who knows what I mean. I basically think him just he probably has such power over I think he's notorious for actually targeting local government anyway. So regardless of how much money he put in over the table, who knows what was going on under the table. So I was always suspicious about that. But I don't know how much time you have, but we certainly have hopefully at least 10 minutes. Can you tell us about this article that you put out today? Was the Pentagon and CIA behind the COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, yeah, and that there was a book published by Andrew Huff that I addressed, and Andrew Huff worked for Eco Health Alliance, which was an NGO which got a lot of money in federal grants for research, and they were one of those grants was for research at the Wuhan lab, and according to Huff, they were involved in unethical gain of function research that he believed led to the manufacture of the COVID virus. And the bat theory. Now there are others like Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia and a collaborator named Neil Harrison put out a paper. And I believe Sachs was initially part of some group some government connected group that was starting to investigate the origin of COVID. And I think he diverted from the government, and he came to believe that it was manufactured in a laboratory, in part because the bat story didn't make sense. They didn't find bats around Wuhan, and none had any marker of that disease, and I think a range of thousands of miles. So there's no indication that a bat near Wuhan. That was the official story originally. And Sachs, after he studied, I think he found some like human tissues in the virus chromosomes that would indicate it came from a human that was manufactured in a lab. And then these gain of function research, where they, in theory, like Fauci has defended it as, in theory, they're cultivating viruses so they could better understand it and stop it or cure it. But many others say, well, it's really mad science. They're actually cultivating the virus for use as bioweapons. And then the motives can be debated as to why they would leak it. But I mean, then there's another book I reviewed there by Michel Chossudovsky, who runs the Global Research website, and he says, it's a global coup d'état. They unleash the virus so they can expand social control, so these pharmaceutical companies can make yet more money, and that they can expand social control over the population and kind of test these draconian lockdown measures and see how far they could go and what the population will accept. This could sadly be the training ground or the forerunner of something even worse. They may have been using this as some kind of social experiment. I mean, I don't know for sure. These are speculation, but there is more and more evidence emerging that this was a laboratory produced virus and that somebody leaked it. They tried to blame China as that theory, but it appeared there was Americans involved, probably American, because the Huff says that his boss Peter Daszak had connection with the CIA, and the CIA was very interested in the gain of function research and was involved. So and then there are documents that have been exposed. There's a Russian researcher named Sasha Ladapova, and I don't know if she filed the Freedom of Information Act, or if she may have, and she's analyzed a set of documents which pointed to Pentagon funding for gain of function research that may have been part of the development of bioweapons. And that's the real purpose behind the manufacture of these viruses. And there is a history going back to the early Cold War, and I've studied that a bit. The U.S. government funded bioweapon development at the secret Fort Detrick Army base in Maryland, and that's where the famous doctor Frank Olson worked, and he was involved in the development of bioweapons that appear to have been used in the Korean War. And then he threatened to blow the whistle on that, and he was very clearly assassinated in 1953, although they framed it as a suicide and that he had taken LSD. But it later came out that the cause of death was a blunt force trauma to the head, and that he had been murdered by two CIA assassins because very likely he was threatening to blow the whistle on the biowarfare program and its use in Korea. And he was a CIA bioweapons expert and scientist. So there's a history of that. So it's not so far fetched to believe, given the nature of the experiments they were doing and given the historical pattern.
Well, a few things there. I always found the lab leak theory a little weird that they were talking about it in Congress and Rand Paul was after Fauci on that, but they always made it sound like it was an accident. And my
Yeah.
thinking was, when they find out, when it's crystal clear that this was manufactured, they're going to have a cover story. And the cover story is, for these kind of things, is that we develop the most awful stuff in case the other side develops that exact same thing and we need an antidote. We'll have a head start, which is not worth the risk. In my opinion, that's not a plausible story. And because they are doing it, it is only, I consider to be a purely hostile, totally unethical and immoral, but the truth will be told. And actually, the first time I had COVID, I had it twice. And both times it was so weird, so unnatural. I mean, I'm old. I've been sick plenty. I used to get bronchitis all the time because I was a smoker. And I never felt anything quite like this. That whole loss of smell and taste, like it was artificial. And so I knew that, I thought that might come out, and so the whole thing seemed like a whitewash, and here I think you're pointing out exactly what would happen. And I want to just say that it's rare that you get to use the word defenestrated in a sentence, but I believe Frank Olson was defenestrated, which means assassinated by being thrown out a window.
Well, yeah, he was. Yeah, although at first he was struck in the head, that may have killed. Either he was dead because in the '90s the Sons ordered an autopsy, and they found he had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. I think before he was thrown
Right.
out,
Okay.
but yeah, probably he died ultimately. That was maybe just to subdue him. Then
Yeah.
they threw him out the window, and that's what killed him. Yeah.
And what about, so you agree that this lab leak thing it's an intentional leak, like it's a bioweapon
Yeah,
but
it was
used
not a
against
leak.
us?
Sorry,
Yeah.
it was yeah, it was deliberately leaked. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I mean, that would be rare for how would this accident? I mean, there is a remote possibility that a worker got it who was working on these gain of function research got it, and that's how it spread, and they wanted to cover up the kind of research they were doing. So I would say that is a possibility. The
I
other
don't think so.
possibility,
Because
yeah,
of the other evidence, like Event 201, when they sat down on October 19th and plotted out exactly how they would conduct an 18-month lockdown for novel coronavirus. I mean, it got to the point where you could predict what would happen next because of the blueprint they laid out. So I understand that that is theoretically possible from just a simple health point of view, but all the other evidence points to this having been planned, in my opinion.
yeah,
Not,
I
not,
would agree too.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would still say it is a slight
Yeah.
possibility.
Okay. Yeah, there is,
But
but
my
man,
instinct would tell me you're right, yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just too much. But this whole idea of bioweapons, I mean, are we not, I mean, have we not signed a treaty where we don't use biological and chemical weapons? Like, and I guess this is one of those cases that I remember you might, I don't know if you ever looked into the Danny Casolaro assassination, man. That there have been a couple of books written
Mhm,
about that,
yeah,
but boy, you
yeah,
could not find a more interesting case. And one of the big things, and it's still there were a couple of there was a murder of a guy coincidentally named David McGowan, not the Dave McGowan, but he was an investigator, law enforcement out in the desert about 10 or 15 years ago, who was assassinated for getting still too close to that Danny Casolaro thing, which was many years ago. And it had to do with Wackenhut using the Cabashan Indian reservation to do things that were illegal in this country. So, and the reservations don't do it anymore because they have casino revenue and they don't need to take that money, but they were exempt from federal laws. But now you look at Ukraine, you look at China, that's why we outsource this thing, which to me feels absolutely like the reason it's illegal here is because it's immoral and it's against our treaties to go to set up a loophole that you can do it on lands that are not under the jurisdiction of the US federal government is to me, it's obvious that they're intentionally doing something that we've all agreed was unconscionable.
yeah. What was the name of the person who got killed who was investigating Castellaro?
David McGowan,
I'm
like
gonna
Dave
look at that.
McGowan. Dave McGowan is a famous author of a
Who
deep
got killed?
researcher who died of cancer not too long ago.
Oh,
But this guy was, I'm going to look it up. McGowan, uh, yeah, DA sleuth among six dead in SoCal. 44-year-old Dave McGowan was found dead with a gunshot wound in the head in May of 2005.
mm.
So that's not cool. But anyway, so yeah, that
Yeah,
was,
and on your point about the Indian, yeah, and they've also done a lot of unethical testing on, like, the Marshall Island and some of the Pacific Islands that they claim sovereignty over. And I mean, the local population, they don't care about the health effects on the local population, just like the Indians. So it's really sad.
yes,
And
that's
I
another
mean,
thing.
they may say the ends justified the mean, but the ends are almost as, if not more sinister than the means. So.
Yes, it does the more you try to give the benefit of the doubt, the harder it gets because not only the evidence just points to these things as being matters of policy, but what they're doing is so on their face immoral that you have to believe they don't have that morality anymore. And actually, I believe that Brzezinski said Zbig said back in the day in that 1971 or 72 America in the Technotronic era that, or around that time, maybe it was in some other article, but that there would emerge an elite, and I'm sure it had already emerged, where our standards of morals just do not apply to them. And I would go further and say, yet they make sure that we maintain those moral standards because in the end you can't have a compliant or complacent population who isn't actually governing themselves. So they need us to have those strong sense of right and wrong so we will govern ourselves because they could not do this all by force. It's all psychological, but they are cynical about it, let's just say.
Yeah, they if you study, yeah, their thoughts and thinking pattern and thoughts, yeah, they have the utmost contempt for regular people and for their intelligence, and think they're so above everyone else. And yet the policy they carry out lead to disaster after disaster for humanity. And I mean, wars like Iraq or Afghanistan, the even the Cold War. I mean, it really was detrimental to a huge portion of humanity. I mean, it's really maybe beneficial only to uh, you know the 1% elite, who can profit off these conflicts that they cause. So it's really just self-interested rather than them. They kind of fashion this, so the grand, Brzezinski was this grand chess master, and look at the chaos and disaster he caused. The Grand Chess Master armed the Mujahideen, the most extreme elements in Afghanistan, and that empowered fundamentalist Islam, led to 9/11 attacks and countless deaths. Uh, so I mean, how strategic really was that? I mean, there was ample opportunity for coexistence. He was so, in his case, he hated Russia so
Yeah.
much, and he came from a family. I did an article about him and his family. His
Oh,
father had fought in the, and then his grandfather fought in the Polish-Soviet War of the early 20s, and they hated the Russians. So I mean, he was
they
like,
were nobility, right?
yeah, the family came from Polish nobility. The Polish hated the Russians, but I mean, it clouded his judgment completely and led to terrible policies for the United States. I mean, so yeah, and there's a book I read by Greg Grandin on Henry Kissinger, and according to his assessment, and Grandin's a very good historian, was that Kissinger was wrong about every single foreign policy decision of his career. And I mean, so yeah, he fast as this genius from Harvard, and this Brzezinski, the chess master, and Kissinger, this allegedly brilliant grand strategist, and yet he was wrong about everything, and he caused terrible misery for people like in Cambodia. I mean, they bombed the hell out of Cambodia to the extent that they drove the entire population insane and fueled the rise of the Khmer Rouge that the U.S. ultimately even supported. And like Chile, I mean, they backed a fascist coup there that just devastated the society. So, I mean, how intelligent is this, and how is it really serving American interests? Is creating hatred for the United States. I mean, the blowback, we're already seeing it in our lifetime. The blowback on American society is tremendous, and it's going to grow worse. So, I mean, they're enacting suicidal policies for their own country, and I mean, it refutes the myth or this image they have of themselves as chess masters, and that's why common people, the common decency, needs to prevail of these sinister elements and elitist elements who would, yeah, do the most depraved thing that are really out of a Nazi playbook when you're talking about these human, perverting science to create viruses, and that's only something that the Nazis would have done.
Yeah, this reminds me of like Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke was the Fed chairman who oversaw 2008, this, helicopter money, zero interest rates in perpetuity, all of that stuff. And I could draw really a very, connect dots very easily from that, and even before that a little bit, to today us experiencing so much inflation. Was his decision to make sure that the regular people suffered for the malinvestment of the banks and stuff that he would not allow to go under. And it was terrible policy, and yet it's supported as he's considered a hero, a genius, whatever, because and because the propaganda machine will take the viewpoint of the elite. And what annoys me so much is that the people who consume that propaganda really have not fully understood that it is us versus them, that the elite have a totally different interest. Our interests are not aligned. They have no connection to their own people, to the nation state or whatever that they are elected to represent, that it's an international power elite. And they, what they describe to us as heroes, are heroes for them, but not for us. And I cannot wait for people to wake up. And maybe people are starting to wake up. I mean, I'll give you the last word on that. Do you think people are beginning to see through this, especially after COVID and who knows what else, maybe after your experience at the anti-war protest? I mean, do you think there is any chance of a growing brush fire of people waking up?
Yeah, I think things have changed. In the 1950s and early 60s. I mean, I think one game changer in the United States was the Kennedy assassination, and not a lot. A large number of people didn't believe in the Warren Commission, and that was kind of the beginning of the loss of innocence in the post World War II era. And I mean, since that time, we've been fed lie after lie, from the Gulf of Tonkin to the WMDs, are just some of the big ones, the Gaddafi and Viagra, to the COVID lies, to the Syria lies, the chemical weapons, to the Ukraine lies, the claim of a unprovoked invasion by Putin. So it's just lie after lie. And I think, yeah, there is now a large sector of the population that does not trust the government. But I think the problem is you had the legacy of McCarthyism in the United States that wiped out a lot of the social movements in the country. Any left wing movement was decimated. Left wing party were destroyed. So the political left has been eviscerated and destroyed. And that's historically the left has offered a counterweight and a countervailing ideology, socialist ideology, which would promote the nationalization of industry and breaking the back of corporate power. So with no left, many people they don't really, they're skeptical, but they don't join any kind of organized political group. And then on the right, you have the libertarians, and they have some influence, but it's not at the level of a large scale political party that can actually challenge the dominant political party at this time. So I think, yeah. So it's, in answer to your question, yes and no. Yes, more and more people are skeptical. They don't trust the government. They see through the lies. A lot of young people, but how does that translate into social and political change? And that has to come through powerful political organizations. And I should say the left was decimated in part because the labor movement was destroyed from during the McCarthy era, and that was in the past a vehicle for the working class to express themselves and promote their interests within the political system. And the economy altered as well, more to the service sector, computer technology, which is less conducive to worker solidarity and identification as part of the working class. So the demise of unions, I think, is important as well. But yeah, it's the lack of political organizations that's what's needed now to challenge the power that be. And I think those may develop in a new way in the coming years, but we're still a starting point with that. And I think new groups are forming, with kind of hybrid ideology like the People's Party. So those are promising developments. We need now for people to coalesce into large organizations that could wield an impact on the electoral system, uh, and that may occur with time.
I do think that one the one thing I feel like is powerful, and I think that's why Ron Paul was a big threat, was just having the ideas in people's minds moves that the Overton window, which is the acceptable spectrum of issue positions that a politician can have and stay in power or retain the support of constituents, that if enough people are awake, that Overton window gets narrower or broader or whatever, and it slows down the political machine a little bit, or it's never going to redirect it because we know what they want total domination. But if you can slow it down, it's not a done deal. I do believe that. So I think it's important to continue to raise awareness, but I agree with you, there has
Yeah.
to be some action. I want next time.
And I would add that, yeah, I mean, these if the social movements grow, they can get some of their own candidates into Congress, and they could start wielding impact. And if people feel that they have the support of large masses, they would feel more emboldened to speak out and try and challenge the power that be on those issues. Whereas if they feel they have to go, because I think one of the things that politicians feel they have to get campaign funds from corporations or powerful interests, so they're going to scale back on what they say. They're not going to speak out to alienate any donors. But if there are large grassroots movements or effective political organizations that could actually get candidates into office without corporate backing, then we'll start to see more people like in Congress speaking out, and more laws to counter some of the terrible laws that now passes.
That's true, and what I want to next time, I never suggested a topic because I really just like to read your articles, and I'll continue to do that. But, which, by the way, people can find on covertactionmagazine.com, and I will put them in the show notes on monicasdeepdives.com. But next time, I might ask your opinion on internationalism, on the UN Agenda 21, on local initiatives being influenced by globalist powers, but I'm gonna save that for next time, and we'll see if we can find some common ground on that too. And with that, I will say thank you so much, Jeremy Kuzmarov, for coming. as always, you have such a wealth of information on so many different articles that you write and things that you dig into and the assassination stuff, and also your activism. I mean, you're on planes going around and being on the ground on these protests, and I appreciate that. And I might ask you also if I can use some of your pictures. I'll certainly put your article about the protests on my website. But I loved your pictures; you were very there. So thank you for your time and all of your efforts.
Great, yeah, thank you, and, my pleasure, yeah, feel free to use the pictures, and I could send them to you or yeah.
Yeah, I got them. They're right in the thing.
Oh, you got it
Okay.
from the article, yeah,
Y-
those are the main ones, yeah. Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
free to use them, absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening and joining us. This is Monica Perez, and you have been listening to a live dive on Deep Dives with Monica Perez.